Hello and welcome to the Scoreboard podcast. I'm your host, Rivka Boord of Jets X Factor, the home of the best New York Jets content on the internet. We'll cover all things Jets here, incorporating the analytics that you won't find anywhere else. So let's just get right into it about what's going on with the Jets this offseason. We'll start off just with news that came out yesterday. Woody Johnson speaking at in Vegas before NFL honors. Been tons of interviews going on with all different for players, coaches, owners, and Woody tends to speak at this event. So this year he was asked about, um, just different things going on with the Jets, and he basically said, "We need a backup quarterback. We didn't have one last year." I mean, that's quite a way to take a shot at Zach Wilson, but he's right for the most part. The Jets didn't have a backup quarterback, but that just shows the greater inconsistency of what they said last year. They, on the one hand, they said that Zach Wilson was going to get a redshirt year, but on the other hand, they didn't sign another backup quarterback. So that kind of even with what Woody Johnson said, that kind of shows that they basically didn't have an alternative for Aaron Rodgers. It was like Rodgers or bust. So with all the reports that Saleh was going, "Woe is me," that Rodgers got hurt. I mean, it seems like it never computed with him that there could be a possibility of anything happening to Rodgers, which, notwithstanding anything else, with any quarterback is just very foolish. Now, you see what happened kind of to the Bengals with when Joe Burrow got hurt and some of the other teams that lost their top quarterbacks. It definitely hurts the ceiling of your team. There aren't going to be too many Nick Foles situations in at this point. But still, you can still be competitive. The Bengals still put up a better product on the field with Jake Browning than the Jets did with Zach Wilson. You saw other backups around the league. Gardner Minshew put together, a decent campaign. You saw Tyrod Taylor when he was on the field. He looked decent. He didn't look great. He wasn't leading the Giants to a million victories, but he just ran a solid offense. So you see how important a backup quarterback is, and the Jets just didn't address it at all. And so for Woody to say that, as much of it's a shot at Zach Wilson, it's really a shot at himself and at just the whole team's attitude. Yeah, you didn't have a backup quarterback, but who neglected to address that? It sounds like it started with Woody Johnson just as much as it was Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh. So that's with Woody Johnson, but it seems pretty evident that the Jets are going to go somewhere to get a backup quarterback, and that Zach Wilson will not be back with his team no matter what. The second thing that's been coming out this week is the Jets lost another key front office member, Chad Alexander. Their director of player personnel went to become the assistant general manager for the Los Angeles Chargers. And so now that leaves the Jets without two of their top personnel guys because they parted ways with Rex Hogan, who was their assistant general manager, and now they lose Chad Alexander. And it's kind of late in the game, especially with the combine not too far away and just off season and everything, to be down your two of your top player personnel guys. But by the same token, I mean, the loss. It's so interesting. When Connor Hughes reported it, he said that Alexander's a rising star in the field, and people, he's going to be a GM one day. I don't understand how being the Jets director of player personnel would lead someone towards getting a promotion to assistant general manager and then eventually becoming a GM. It's not as if the Jets have done such a terrific job with player personnel. Now, if he was involved in the draft, okay, you could give more credit for 2022 for that draft year, which obviously looks like it could be one of the best drafts in history, based on what's been coming out of that so far. But still, I mean, even the Jets drafting, okay, they got something from Joe Tippmann this past year. It looks promising. You don't really know about Will McDonald. Looked like a very good prospect. But other than that, I mean, 2020, 2021 were pretty bad. And just in general, the Jets overall, their player personnel, certainly with free agency, has been way more misses than hits. And so it's just interesting to see a Jets player personnel after a year where they were almost all let go. Everyone would have been canned. That all of a sudden he's getting a promotion. So if anything, I think for the Jets, starting fresh with player personnel might be a positive thing, especially if they bring in someone who's not just going to bring in guys who Robert Saleh has coached before, or some of the other players have coached before, Aaron Rodgers' cronies, just because they say so, and maybe actually would take a look at some of the film, maybe, and have a better look at the film before they hire someone. So that's that. And the fact that the Jets have lost, they lost Zach Azzani, their receiver coach. He went to Pittsburgh to be their receiver coach. They let Taylor Embry go, brought in Tony Dews. There's a bunch of lower level back and forth going on with their coaching staff. But to me, that's mostly it's a good thing to get rid of some of these guys because they didn't seem to be doing anything. Like the running back situation, let's say. For running backs, I mean, yeah, Breece Hall is Breece Hall, but did Taylor Embry really develop him into a great running back? No. Breece came into the NFL as one of the best backs in the league and probably easily would have been offensive rookie of the year had he not gotten injured. Um, so he doesn't really get any credit for that. If anything, I look at it and say Dalvin Cook looked even worse than his underlying numbers said he was in Minnesota. He looked totally washed. And then Izzy Abanikanda couldn't get on the field because he couldn't learn how to pass block. So where does a running back coach get any credit from that? So I don't really care that they let him go. And the receivers coach, I mean, Alan Lazard looked even by Alan Lazard standards, and he wasn't very good before he came to the Jets, notwithstanding his 785 yards in his last year with Green Bay, but he looked much, much worse than he ever did before. I mean, are you going to give the receiver coach flack for that? I don't know. It was a pretty bad situation overall, but certainly having McCall Hardman turn from a number 4 receiver to an unplayable receiver, you have to ask yourself about that. Just in general, like, did the Jets receiver show anything? I mean, Garrett Wilson is Garrett Wilson, and even Garrett Wilson, let's take a little sneak and say Garrett Wilson didn't look as good in 2023 as he did in 2022 with almost equally bad quarterbacking situations. He just didn't. He had a harder time with catching the ball. He did not make many contested catches, although that was an issue in 2022. Also, he just didn't get as much yak as he did the year before. He was overall less explosive. Now, a lot of that had to do with just the Jets' putrid receiver situation. It was much worse even than in 2022. But still, overall, the Jets' receiver room, there was certainly no reason to keep Azani around unless you thought that he was going to somehow bring Cortland Sutton over to the Jets, which I don't personally believe. If Denver wanted to trade, they would trade. Sutton probably wouldn't have a say in the matter. So, anyways, with the Jets coaching, they do need to get some of replacements for some of these positions, especially their player personnel guys. But I don't really think it's the end of the world. Now, the next topic that's on everyone's mind that we've been talking about a lot, although there's tons of draft talk going on because of the Senior Bowl and the Shrine Bowl, but really free agency is going to be the first step after after the Super Bowl. And so free agency for the Jets is going to be a very interesting situation because they don't have a lot of cap space to work with. I think they're only like around 4 or 5 million right now. And they already have, they have a lot of players with void years, and they started playing the void year game last year. And now they also don't have so they don't have a lot of space to work with, and they have a lot of needs. But at the same time, they cannot just rely on the draft for anything because they don't have a second round pick. And there's only so much you can fill in the draft and expect a rookie, especially if you're going to say that you're trying to go all in on a Super Bowl window. And that means that the Jets are going to have to probably play the void year game even more, start pushing money into the future, which is going to bode very poorly for them when they want to sign Garrett Wilson and Sauce Gardner and Jermaine Johnson and Breece Hall to extensions, even Elijah Vera Tucker. I mean, they have to sign Michael Carter to an extension this offseason unless they want to start letting him test the market next year, which would be a huge mistake. So the Jets are not in a good cap situation, but they're going to focus on this year. This is where they need to go. We'll go by position. We'll start with just backup quarterback because Woody obviously acknowledged that this is a key need for the Jets. Now you hope that when they try to choose a quarterback, they don't mess around and they just go for one of the top guys available. So, Jacoby Brissett is always a big name out there because he actually had a very good year in Cleveland as a starter when Deshaun Watson was suspended. Played very solidly. He didn't win a ton, but his actual performance was more than enough. If the Jets had Jacoby Brissett this past year, they would have made the playoffs. I don't think that that's too bold of a statement, both because of the way he looked in Cleveland and because of the way he looked in Washington when he played a bit this past year. So you have Jacoby Brissett, Gardner Minshew also. The problem with those guys is they're probably going to command $8 to $10 million a year. Brissett was making $8 million last year. There's no reason to think he'll make anything different this year. So the question is if the Jets want to spend that. You have Ryan Tannehill, who's older and therefore might command less. But the question about Tannehill is how much he has left in the tank. He looked pretty bad in Tennessee this past year. So the question is if the Jets are just signing another Joe Flacco at this point if they get Tannehill, because Tannehill might come a little cheaper. He's projected to get more like in the $5 million range, but are you getting actually that quality backup who could hold down the fort? Again, Tannehill is I think 35 years old. And then another one is Tyrod Taylor, also getting older. Let's check how old Tyrod Taylor is exactly. Tyrod Taylor is 34 years old, so he's also on the older side. But when he played with the Giants this past year, he didn't look great. He looked like the Tyrod Taylor we're used to seeing. Takes a lot of sacks. Basically one read and go, trying to make something happen out of the pocket. But he can run an offense. The Giants somehow, after all the mess with Daniel Jones, when Tyrod Taylor was in there, their offense, even with a horrific offensive line, was worse than the Jets last year. It looked like an NFL offense. They didn't score a ton of points. They didn't do a ton of stuff, but he could hit an occasional deep ball. He could keep the offense moving. Hit the quick pass. He's not going to throw a lot of touchdown passes, but he's going to avoid interceptions. He's never been a big turnover guy, and Tyrod Taylor might be a good option for around the $5 to $6 million range. Taylor maybe not as great of a fit as some of the other quarterbacks just because he's more of a runner, and sometimes you want a guy who fits is this more of a similar profile to your starting quarterback. But honestly, Rodgers may not be a scrambler anymore, but he also people didn't talk about this was one of the reasons why it might have not been such a great idea for him to try to come back is Rodgers likes to maneuver around in the pocket, run out of the pocket a little bit, extend plays. And so that would be kind of similar with Taylor in that way. But they really need to get one of these just backup quarterbacks who have shown in recent seasons that they can still keep an offense together if a catastrophe hits. Now, are the Jets going to win a Super Bowl with one of those quarterbacks? Probably not. But then again, you watch. Let's say, for example, you even watch the Chiefs this like let's say last week against or in the AFC Championship against Baltimore. They scored 17 points. They could barely move the ball, but they won primarily through the strength of their defense. And so a team with a good defense, if you have a competent quarterback, you have weapons, and we'll get to the offensive line later. Yeah, and the receivers later, but you already have a couple of really good weapons in Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall. You get a couple more. You never know. The Jets really do have a defense that could be championship worthy, despite some of the things that drive you crazy. Ultimately, you look at everything afterward. That defense is good enough to win, and so that's the story for quarterback. Now, backup running back. There are going to be there's always a lot of big names out there because that's how the running back position works. When a guy is 28, 29 years old, they are going to be available on the market, and they're going to want more money than they deserve. So Michael Nania wrote an article about the Jets' best options at backup running back. I think a lot of the names that he chose are probably going to command more money than the Jets want to spend because this is a position where they really do not want to spend top dollar. Spend a couple $1,000,000, try to get your RB2. Izzy is going to be the third running back. He still has a lot to learn. He didn't really look good when he was on the field. He's never had a reputation as a pass catcher or a pass blocker. The Jets need both of those in their backup running back. And so now the Jets should not be looking for someone to complement Breece per se. Breece should be their starting running back, getting the lion's share of the snaps, which ultimately he did for a lot of the end of the season once they dumped Dalvin Cook. But that they shouldn't come in thinking they're going to do some sort of split with Breece, kind of like they did in his rookie year. No, Breece Hall is the starting running back, so you just need someone to spell him, third down back, blocker, pass catcher, guy who can maybe grind out some yards if you need it. And so my personal favorite option is Antonio Gibson because he's been a very good receiving option out of the backfield, and I like that idea. I like that idea even of having him in the backfield with Breece at times. And then also he's, again, I'm not sitting here watching his film as a pass blocker, but for what it's worth, he's been, kind of a third down back for Washington for a little while, and he's gotten good PFF grades as a pass blocker the last couple of years, although before that he wasn't necessarily so great. But I like the idea of Antonio Gibson. I think he'll cost in the $3 million range, and I think he would be a good backup to get. Patrick Taylor from Green Bay, if the Jets want to go really cheap, he's very light volume on his tires. Also, and Gibson also, but these are younger players. Let's check how old Patrick Taylor is. Taylor Packers age. Yeah, so Taylor looks like he's 20. He'll be 26 in April, so also on the younger side. but also has had good efficiency numbers, decent blocking numbers from his time in Green Bay. Come back, you could probably get him in at the veteran minimum, 1.2, 1.1, 1.2 million, and he could potentially be an option. The Jets should stay away from guys like Ezekiel Elliott for sure, who's been wildly inefficient for a couple of years now. Even though he looked quote unquote better in New England, his underlying numbers were still really bad. And then you have after Zeke, you have guys like obviously Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs, Austin Eckler, some of these names, DeAndre Swift. All these guys are going to be signed to deals that are bigger than the Jets want to pay. So those guys really shouldn't be in the conversation. Gus Edwards from the Ravens is another possibility because he is getting older. I think he's 29, but he's just been very efficient. He could also be a short yardage guy, but then again, he comes from a gap scheme, so it could be that even though the Jets don't play as heavy of a zone scheme or didn't play as heavy as a scheme in the first year under Hackett as they did with Mike LaFleur, still, if they want to run more zone than gap, it's possible that Gus Edwards wouldn't be an ideal fit. Also running behind a really good Ravens offensive line, always one of the top run blocking offensive lines in the league. So, but again, the Jets are looking, here's where they're looking for a guy who would be more efficient, who has good efficiency numbers, but would still be cheap. So I think Gibson and Taylor might be their two best options here. Now we get to one of the positions. By the way, I'm just going in order of classic how positions are listed: quarterback, running back, receiver. We'll go to offensive line, and then we'll go to the defense. And so when you look at receivers, so we've been talking about this, and the names are going to be very familiar, and obviously we talked about it a lot. So my number one option at receiver for the Jets is Mike Evans. I think he is, he's been doing it for a decade. He's showing no signs of slowing down. He was still, it was this past year was one of his most efficient seasons as a receiver. Still a huge touchdown guy. Still a big deep threat. Very efficient. His hands are shaky, but they've gotten better over recent years. Notwithstanding a couple of bad drops he had in the playoffs, he still is a guy who won a ring with Tom Brady. We've seen him make deep catch after deep catch, can still get open all over the field. And Evans would be a perfect complement to Garrett Wilson because then you couldn't double anyone, and those guys would just eat up yardage. You could imagine those two. You get Mike Evans, you can probably play. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily recommend the Jets do it, but you can probably play Allen Lazard as your third receiver and still be fine because you have one of the best receiver tandems at, not 1-2 punches in the NFL. The problem is that Evans loves Tampa. He loves living there. And even if you're coming from Tampa, why on earth would you come to New Jersey? You have the state tax, you have the weather, you have just the team. Tampa made the playoffs this past year and the Jets didn't. It's a softer path towards the Super Bowl from in the NFC than it is in the AFC. And Evans will have a million suitors. I mean, you can think of a couple of other really good teams that have a need for a receiver, such as the Kansas City Chiefs. The Buffalo Bills are gonna, could use a number two receiver. Some of these teams that could really use another guy, and so the Jets would have tons and tons of competition for Evans. It's reported that he might command between 25 and 30 million dollars, which would be very, very steep. I think he's worth it, but the chances that the Jets are going to be able to pay Evans and end up with him are not that great. Michael wrote an article, an article about T. Higgins, basically explaining, notwithstanding his age and his reputation as a number one receiver, Higgins really is a number two, and he's going to be paid like a number one. He's probably going to get the $23 to $26 million contract. In 2023, he didn't just play like a number two, he played almost like a poor number two in terms of a lot of his numbers. You can go check out Michael's article for the details about T. Higgins. Um, I would pass on T. Higgins. I really think that he's overhyped and he's not the player. He's not the player that you want to really splurge for. I would take that money and give it to Mike Evans over T. Higgins any day of the week because to me, Evans is still a true number one receiver. And so you can pay him like one, even though the Jets are looking for a number two. After T. Higgins, there's Michael Pittman. The thing about Pittman is, first of all, just like with Higgins, both of them are almost certainly going to be tagged. It would be very foolish of their teams not to tag them. I think that the Colts will probably end up extending Pittman just because with Anthony Richardson returning and after they gave Jonathan Taylor an extension, it would be really foolish to let their number one receiver go. The thing about Pittman and the reason why he's not an ideal fit for the Jets is because he's mostly a short area of the field kind of guy, and it doesn't complement Garrett Wilson enough. Now, I'm not saying Pittman's bad, and in many ways he does fit a number 2 receiver profile. But I just don't think he's going to take enough pressure off Garrett Wilson because he's not that deep threat the Jets need. He's more of a possession type receiver. And so, again, I would hesitate to give him number 1 receiver money when I see him more as a number 2. Although I think I might be more inclined. I'm not sure between him and Higgins. I would have to look. But either way, most likely Higgins and Pittman are very, very unlikely to be available. After those three, the next guy that would be talked about in free agency, we're not talking about Davante Adams in the trade market. The next best guy in free agency is Calvin Ridley, and Ridley might actually be the best option for the Jets. Joe Blewett has said many times that Ridley's a really good route runner. Had a bad down year in Jacksonville. You can check out Andrew Fialco has an article either that came out or is soon going to come out about Ridley, and he still has a lot of talent. Jacksonville didn't necessarily put him in an ideal role to succeed, but he could be, as a number 2 receiver behind Christian Kirk, when he was not asked to be the number 1, and when he could just run a lot of deep routes. Ridley's a really good deep threat. He's not a big yak guy, and that's not ideal. But again, if you're going to be a deep target very often, you're not going to get as much yak just because those passes tend to be a lot of times more, you have to, the ball's not thrown perfectly, you have to catch up to it. Deep passes are not as conducive to yak as shorter ones. So, but Ridley just in general, if you have a guy who can get open, Rodgers will get them the ball. And so Ridley is probably their best option. He's projected to get between 16 and 18 million a year. Ideally, I would like to get him for cheaper than that. I'd also prefer to give him a 3-year deal over a 4-year one. But I think that Ridley might be the most realistic option for the Jets, and he would fulfill the requirement of being a number 2 receiver. Because after Ridley, though, again, if you can't, on the trade market, you can't get Davante Adams, maybe you look at Courtland Sutton. I wrote an article about Courtland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy. I'm not enamored of either one of them, but I guess you could say that they would fit the number 2 receiver mark, although some of them, they're a lot of the production they've actually put up doesn't necessarily match what you would expect from a number 2 receiver, even not just in terms of raw production, but also underlying numbers. But let's say you can't get any of those guys. You're really looking at the, Curtis Samuels of the world, Tyler Boyd, Darnell Mooney are names you're going to hear. Let's look at some of the other free agent receivers that are out there. Odell Beckham Jr., Gabe Davis, Hollywood Brown, DJ Chark. I mean, the problem is that most of these guys are number 3 receivers at best. Honestly, OBJ, the Jets didn't get him last year. He kind of burned his bridges a bit with some of the things he said. He actually had a better year than his numbers would indicate. His raw numbers would indicate. He was probably still an above-average receiver overall in 2023 by his production, but he's definitely not a number 2 receiver at this point in his career. Gabe Davis totally got by the end of the season, he was Josh Allen's number 4 or number 5 option. He was totally surpassed. You had after Stephon Diggs, who didn't have a great year of his own, but you had Dalton Kincaid, you had Khalil Shakir, and even James Cook was taking targets from Gabe Davis. So even though Davis is a deep threat, he's a very, very hit or miss, does not do well against man coverage, and I would stay very far away from him. I think he's a very underwhelming option. Boyd and Samuel are slot receivers, very similar in a lot of ways. Boyd has been a little bit more productive over his career. Samuel had a slightly more production in terms of underlying numbers in 2023. Both of them slot, 70+%. Boyd 85% of his snaps in the slot. Not going to be more than a number 3 receiver. You can make them your starting slot receiver, and that's fine, but you pay them like a number 3, and you need to get someone else to be the number 2. You're definitely not signing both of them because they're both slot-only receivers. So you would take one or the other, and then you still need a guy on the outside to take pressure off of Garrett Wilson. Where are you going to find that? DJ Chark has been very underwhelming and become even more underwhelming over the years. Darnell Mooney seems to be further and further away from his great year with Chicago. Hollywood Brown had a terrible year this past year. Did almost nothing as a deep threat, which is supposed to be his stock and trade. Some of these other names, if you're not going to sign, if you're not going to get one of the big names or Ridley, to me, you have to sign a Hollywood Brown and and one of those slot receivers, and maybe one of these other guys. I happen to like Josh Reynolds from Detroit. I just feel like he's a first down guy. He's kind of someone you can rely on when you need him. But you're going to need to sign multiple guys, probably then also worry about it in the draft. It'll be a disaster. The Jets really need to end up with either Evans, Pittman, Ridley, Devontae Adams, or one of these guys. Uh, that it's just they're going to be in big trouble if not. So that's the wide receiver position. We're not even going to talk about tight end, although I kind of not sold on Jeremy Ruckert. I would like them to bring in someone at least to compete with him for the number two receiver tight end position, but they may not be able to afford that. They may want to just rely on the cheaper options. So we're not going to talk about tight end. Offensive tackle. So this is another one where the big discussions among Jet fans. This is another one where I think at the very least the Jets need to get a stud left tackle. They can rely on right tackle. I don't love waiting to the draft, but I think at this point it seems that there will be someone available there that the Jets, again, we'll see what things look like after the combine and as the draft gets closer, but it does look like there's a good chance that there could be at least two good tackles for the Jets to take there, although which one, Joe Blewett doesn't seem to agree with the assessments for most other people. He has J.C. Latham as a second-ranked tackle. But either way, a lot of the tackles that might be available for the Jets at number 10, unless Joe Alt falls, would be right tackles. I know a lot of people are sold on Olaf Fushanu. The Jets seem to like Fuaga a lot, so Talisi Fuaga. So we'll see what happens with that. But there's a good chance. Jets certainly do not want to get a guy who's a right tackle only and be stuck moving someone else over the left tackle. Therefore, my preferred option, even though it's very risky, is to just get Tyron Smith from Dallas. He has the highest upside in terms of production, the longest track record of doing it, stud pass blocker. Yes, we know there are injuries, and trust me, I've been on Joe Douglas's case for signing injury-prone tackles. But this is my philosophy. You get Tyron Smith, he's usually good for 11 to 13 games in a season and of top-tier production, and then he's usually around for the playoffs. You sign him and you sign a decent swing tackle. Yes, I know things can go wrong from there, but at that point I'm like, you made a reasonable plan. I don't know if it's possible to have every contingency plan at tackle, and honestly, the other options are just not very appealing to me. Like Mike Onwenu, so people talk about him from Green Bay. I have a few questions about him. First of all, his regardless of what his pass blocking stats were, PFF didn't love his performance in 2023. And yes, I don't necessarily trust PFF, but when they are not as high on someone who everyone else is very high on, and the guy is a guard who was suddenly moved to tackle, I want to watch his film before I say this guy's a stud. Because to me, still, Mike Onwenu does his best job as a right guard or as a guard. He's been a stud guard with the Patriots. Suddenly moving him to tackle, I don't know if tackle's his best position. He's young. He's going to get paid at a very, very high, a very high rate, probably premium. He's going to get $17 million a year. And he played right tackle, and I'm just not sure about him. Plus, you come Patriots, very gap-heavy scheme. The Jets certainly don't play a gap-heavy scheme. Not sure how he would be in a scheme that leans more towards zone. I'm very wary of taking Patriots guys. And that actually applies to the guy on the other side even more so, to Trent Brown. Forget about it. Jets fans should be running as far away as possible from Trent Brown. First of all, if you don't want the Jets to draft J.C. Latham because you think he's another Mekhi Becton, listen to this thing about Trent Brown. Trent Brown literally had clauses in his contract and incentives in his contract if he would keep his weight below a certain amount at each point in training camp and throughout the season. For example, if he came to training camp at under 380 or 385 pounds, think about 385 pounds. We were knocking Mekhi Becton for his weight. The guy has a bonus in his contract for coming in for under 380 something pounds. The guy, has had issues with motivation and weight throughout his career. And, even though he had the best year of his career this past in 2023, Patriots guy, can't move, no athleticism, hard pass. Sorry, Trent Brown is going to get very overpaid and tons of red flags there. Jets should stay very far away. Past that, you're really looking at a lot of mid-tier guys who may get overpaid. The classic guy is Jonah Williams. Cincinnati the production has never matched the hype as a first-round pick. Picked I think a year before Becton. Never played this past year on the fifth-year option, lost his left tackle job. Cincinnati signed Orlando Brown Jr., which turned out to work horrifically for them in his first year. Brown was terrible, but they signed Brown and moved Williams over to compete at the time with Lyle Collins until Collins obviously was not healthy and was released. But they didn't even guarantee him the right tackle spot. That just tells you what Cincinnati thought about Williams. And when a team tells you something about their own player, very often you should believe them, especially a team that was looking to protect their franchise quarterback in Joe Burrow. So, Jonah Williams would not be very high on my list. After that, you look at some of the other tackles. The next name is Jermaine I'm not even sure to pronounce his last name, Eluamunor, from Vegas. And the problem with him is that he's had back-to-back years of good production. But first of all, in 2022, after his 2022 season, he signed a $3.5 million deal, which means someone didn't think he was anything more than a backup. He didn't start the season as a starter, and then Vegas started rotating him with another tackle. And so if Vegas, again, they're telling you what they thought, so I don't care what the numbers say about him. I would be very, very wary of Eluamunor. The only way I would sign him is to compete for a spot and not to give him the starter spot. After that, if you look at Michael Nania's article rating all the free agent linemen, the next two guys are Andrus Peat and Chris Hubbard. Both of them are, I would say, average. Pete's slightly better, a little bit more balanced. Hubbard's a better run blocker. Overall, these are veterans. You're not going to pay them a ton of money. You'll probably get them for in the $5, $6, $7 million range. Personally, I'm on board. If you're not going to get Tyron Smith, you should go this route, but I still very much prefer Tyron Smith. After that, you have Alaric Jackson from the Rams, who just is not going to inspire a lot of confidence, but he's 25 years old, so he's like the classic guy who's going to get overpaid, like Mike McGlinchey did last year. And look how that Mike McGlinchey deal looks after one season. Another guy to look out for is George Fant. We know that he can play left tackle. Had a solid pass blocking year for Houston. We know he's a bad run blocker. We also know he has an injury history. I think the Fant bridge is burned after the Jets didn't sign him to an extension. He seemed very eager not to come back to the Jets last year, but who knows? Maybe he's someone, that could be available. Look at some of the other, and after that, you have just a bunch of guys who are subpar in both pass game or run game. If I were the Jets, I would not come anywhere near Mekhi Becton with a 20-foot pole. He was terrible. He's injury prone. He is a bad influence in all those ways. I don't think Becton has any upside. You can look at his talent, and first-round picks have 9 lives, but I would not re-sign Mekhi Becton. So that's the tackle position. Then you have the guard position. So the question is, there are a few questions here. Are the Jets, first of all, what are they going to do with Laken Tomlinson? Even if they just release Tomlinson outright, no post-June 1st, designation, they'll get $8 million free. They can replace Tomlinson with an upgrade for $8 million. If they want to do it post-June 1st, it would be $13 million. The problem is they wouldn't actually save that money. That money wouldn't actually come off their books, the Tomlinson books, until June 1st, until June 2nd. And the problem is that Tomlinson's cap hit next year is $18.8 million. And so I could see it going either way. I could very much see the Jets just cutting him outright. I could also see them keeping him. I think keeping him would be a big mistake. He's had back-to-back years of atrocious. He was much worse in 2023 overall, even than in 2022. I don't think you can keep a guy like that around. I don't know. He was very overhyped in San Francisco, but he looked more like the guy from Detroit all those years. Maybe Trent Williams just made him look better than he was. And so if they do release Tomlinson, so then they need a left guard. But then the question is, what do they do with Elijah Vera Tucker? Do they put him at guard? Do they put him at tackle? They said they want to keep him at one position. A lot of people think that position is going to be tackle, but as Joe Blewett keeps reiterating, AVT's ceiling is at guard. And therefore, do you want a guy with an all-pro ceiling, or do you want a guy who can be solid but really nothing more than that? So the thing with AVT, and Blewett says he doesn't care what the numbers say, AVT is a better player, much better player at tackle. So even though the pass blocking numbers say at guard. So even though the pass blocking numbers say he's better at tackle, I go by what Joe Blewett says because he's our best film guy and he really knows the ins and outs of what's going on. And so you have AVT. Looking at the film myself, I see what he's talking about, but meaning this is his This is, pretty much the Jets X Factor consensus is that AVT should be at guard. But then again, it could be that in terms of value, that it'll be easier to find a competent guard than a competent tackle. And if you're looking just for your best five in competency, maybe the Jets should put AVT at right tackle. So that leaves another question of how many guards do they need? And then there's another question with that is, do you want to play Joe Tippmann at guard or center? Because the thing about him is that he struggles with snapping the ball still. And so therefore, technically, Tippmann looked pretty decent at guard. And so they can put him at guard and then look for a guard and a center, or just for a center, or whatever. So there's a lot of moving parts here. But the way I see it is that the Jets should keep AVT at guard, sign a left tackle, cut Tomlinson, sign a guard, another guard, keep Tippmann at center, and then draft a right tackle. That's the train that I'm on. And therefore, so at guard, there are several options. Obviously, the top of the market is going to be Robert Hunt and Kevin Dotson. Both of them are 27. Hunt has had more of a consistent track record of success. Dotson is more of a one-hit wonder that you would more question. Hunt also, you have your questions about him because Mike McDaniel tends to make offensive linemen look better than they are. But Hunt, if you want to splurge for him, maybe you could go for him. I'm personally not necessarily in the thought process of splurging for a guard again. I'd rather splurge for a tackle, especially since you need two of them. The guards that I have my eye on more, I would love Kevin Zeitler of the Ravens. I think, yeah, he'll be 34, and yeah, he's not an ideal run blocker, but honestly, and he also had a bad year his last year with the Giants, but I think for the most part of his whole career, last few years with the Ravens, he's just been solid. I feel like he's the kind of guy that you take, he's solid, he'll be solid, you can plug and play him, and he'll be good. Another guy I'm interested in, and this guy I'm actually maybe slightly more interested in for a few reasons, is James Hurst from New Orleans, 32 years old, probably not going to get him for a huge deal. The thing about him is that throughout his career, he's been a below average run blocker, but he's a very solid pass blocker. And the thing is, he did that at guard and he did that at tackle with New Orleans. He entered the season as their swing tackle and then became their starting guard, or at least he looked like he was a swing tackle on their depth chart. And so to me, he can also serve as a backup tackle. The Jets have Wes Schweitzer, who can serve as, obviously he's certainly not an ideal starting guard. He's more of a pretty bad starter, but he's an okay backup. But, if you had to, if one of the tackles got injured, I would kick Hurst out to tackle. And the thing is, he can play left tackle. He has a lot of experience at tackle. And so I tend to be on the train of possibly James Hurst. Other guys are Graham Glasgow, guards. You have John Runyon from Green Bay if the Jets want to try a reunion with him. Reputation is to be a much better pass blocker, not as good of a run blocker. Ezra Cleveland from Jacksonville. Michael wrote about this one. Cleveland. The problem with Cleveland is that he has a very shaky record in the past as a pass blocker outside of a 10-game sample size in 2023 before he was traded. And so even though he's 25 years old, he's probably going to command a contract that's too large for what he's worth. So I would stay away. But these are, the starting guard options. Zeitler and Hurst are my top two. Runyon is probably my third. So that would be guard. That's where I'm taking it. Now, on the defensive side of the football, obviously one of the Jets' biggest questions is what they do with Bryce Huff. And from everything we're hearing from all the Jets reporters, they do not think the Jets are bringing back Huff. Now, I have to say that not bringing back Huff and letting him walk without franchise tagging him would be one of the dumbest decisions Joe Douglas could ever make, and I'll explain why. People keep talking about you're going to get a comp pick for him. There are two things about that. Number one, comp picks will not happen until 2025. The Jets need draft capital now. But the more important thing is there's a very good chance the Jets would not even end up with that comp pick, because the way comp picks work is that you only get comp picks for guys who you lost in free agency for whom you did not sign an equivalent, a guy of an equivalent level. So the way comp picks work, and I wrote an article about this, you can go check it out, but basically the NFL assigns a round to a comp pick round to every guy, depending on his contract, his playing time, and several other things. And so if a guy gets a big contract, a lot of times the highest possible comp pick is a third-round pick. A lot of times a guy who signs a big contract is going to get a third-round comp pick. The problem is that let's say the Jets let Huff go and would expect a third-round comp pick, let's say they then sign Mike Evans, or let's say they then sign Tyron Smith, or let's say even Calvin Ridley it could be. and then they're worth also a third round comp pick. Guess what happens? Bryce Huff totally nullified. Jets don't get any comp pick for Bryce Huff. He leaves for nothing. You let this young guy who has been one of the best pass rushers in the NFL walk for nothing. I can't entirely blame the Jets for not trying to sign him last year because he had only played 16% or 17% of their snaps, and so it was very hard for them to know that he would be able to translate his production the way he did. Um, Especially since they were also tight on cap space this past year, particularly if they wanted to bring Rodgers in. But still, I mean, to me, you franchise tag him at the very least. If someone wants to get him, they have to give you some compensation for him. Even if that compensation is a fourth round pick, at least you get something for him. You can't let him go for nothing. And I think you could get more than that because the way it works with a franchise tag is yes, it's going to count against their cap, but if they can trade him earlier in the offseason, he would be he's easily the best or in the top two edge rushers on the market. If you if you want to trade him, there'll probably be, edge rushers are very well valued in the NFL. Teams like the Bears and Commanders have a lot of cap space. Someone is going to trade for him, and then what they'll do is they'll work out an extension for him that's more market value. When you do a tag and trade, usually the understanding is the team that tagged the guy lets him seek a trade. They negotiate a contract with another team. You trade the guy, and then they sign the contract, and the tag is ripped up. And so, to me, this is what the Jets should be doing, but apparently they may not want to hamstring their cap like that. Maybe they don't have confidence that they'd be able to trade him right away. And so Huff might be a goner. And if Huff is gone, the Jets need to sign someone else because they would only have 4 edge rushers. And it would be kind of scary because if they want to rotate, JFM only plays like 38% of his snaps on the edge. And then you have Jermaine Johnson, who played like 66% of the snaps, but that means you're really counting on Will McDonald to step into a very substantial edge defender share. So if Huff does go, then you have to sign another guy. The question is, you want to go the Devian Clowney mercenary route. He had a much better year as a pass rusher than he'd ever had before with the Ravens. Suspect that because the Ravens had such a good defense. You have, other guys like Jonathan Grenard from Houston, who's still going to get probably a nice sized contract of his own, probably too lucrative for the Jets. I suggested Van Ginkel from Miami, who played very well for Miami this past year in more of a rotational role. He's always a thorn in the Jets' side whenever they play him. Had a really good year as a pass rusher. Has always been a solid run defender. So I would go for Van Ginkel. I think he'll cost more in the $7 to $8 million range. For a couple of years, I think that would be the Jets' best course of action if they do let Huff go. Defensive tackle. So now there's the question over here. Most Jets fans assume they're going to re-sign Quinton Jefferson because he's just been a consistent pass rusher. He cost about $3.5 million last year. Probably won't cost much more than that this year. But then the problem with Jefferson is you always have to sign a run-stuffing defensive tackle. Now with Al Woods, tore his Achilles, probably going to retire. Even if he doesn't retire, you can't bring him back at this point. And even with the Jets, even though he did a good job as a run defender, he just brings too little as a pass rusher that he's almost, teams like to pass the ball when he's in the game because he's such a zero as a pass rusher. I mean, he brings nothing in that area. And so the Jets should probably try to find someone who's a good run defender who has a little bit more in that area. The problem is figuring out exactly who that should be is a little complicated based on the numbers because the thing is PFF, when they give you the place that a player lines up, they don't differentiate between the techniques. So Al Woods lined up primarily at the 2-eye technique this past year. But PFF includes 2-eye, 2 and 3 technique all in the same thing. They just call it over the B gap. And so but there is a difference between a player at the 2-eye. 2-eye is going to be a little bit bigger, more like the 0 or 1, a little bit bigger, whereas the 3 or where Quinnen plays, plays more of a 3-tech. They're very often not going to be that same big physical run stopper. And so the Jets are looking for that. The guy I like is Maurice Hurst from Cleveland. Had a very nice year for them before he got injured. The problem with him is that injuries have dogged him throughout his career, but the plus side is that he would be extremely cheap. He was on a $1.5 million deal last year. And so I like the idea of him. I would also possibly go for Cleveland's starting defensive tackle, Shelby Harris. Harris has a kind of a balanced profile as a pass rusher, run defender. Also was on a predicted $3.5 million deal. Michael Nania wrote an article about 2 real bargain basement guys such as Armon Watts and Jonathan Harris. Watts is from Pittsburgh. Harris is from, I think, Denver. Guys who you can get for cheap. Jets would be looking. They can also go the draft route there because in the fourth, fifth round, you might be able to find a guy who's just a run stuffer and have them, play 35% of the snaps. Kind of, I think Woods was at 32%. So you could have a guy play that amount and still make it work. Uh, that's what the Jets need. Now, alternatively, instead of going the Jefferson route, they could spend a little bit more money and sign a starting defensive tackle like Fletcher Cox. Cox's pass rush is not at this point is not anywhere near what Jefferson's is, but he's a better run stopper. So I think the Jets are probably going to re-sign Jefferson and just go that way again, just because it's cheaper. They have to, especially if they're going to sign a receiver, a number two receiver, and or a top tackle. They do need to go cheaper in some areas, and that the defensive tackle is one of the places I think they can. Linebacker. I have a feeling they're going to run back the same linebacker crew. Even with Chaz Surratt, maybe Zaire Barnes will actually be active this year. We'll see. The Jets have, after what they showed with Quincy Williams, you trust them more than you would otherwise to develop a linebacker. Zaire Barnes has a lot of the same athletic traits that Quincy Williams does, and he presents a very similar profile on the field, so maybe the Jets can develop him. But then at safety, so the Jets, they have Tony Adams. Presumably he's going to be their starter next year. I would like them to see them sign a different, someone who could be a legitimate free safety. But for who knows, just as they had Jason Pinnock as their backup free safety a couple years ago, they could end up with, if they like Jarrett Bernard-Converse. Now, he missed a lot of his rookie season. He was on the PUP list. But if they like him, they could just end up using him as their backup free safety. But at strong safety, they have Chuck Clark and Ashton Davis, both free agents. I would bring them both back. Clark, we loved him at JetX. We thought it was Joe Douglas's best move last offseason. And then, of course, he goes, and the guy who had not missed a snap in years had, of course, tears his ACL and OTAs. And so, but I would still bring him back because his game was never as predicated on speed as some others. He used a lot of his smarts and technique, and so I think that he'll still be able to come back strong. Very good run stopper, just good instincts, can cover tight ends. I think Chuck Clark would be I was sad not to be able to see how he performed with the Jets this past season. And I think Chuck Clark would be a great addition. Ashton Davis did an excellent job in the Jets role that they gave him, which was that big nickel third linebacker type. Rather than giving Jamie Sherwood the spot because Sherwood struggles in coverage, Davis did a good job in the box. Still misses too many tackles. Still not a guy you would want covering deep. But if you have him as a coverage guy in the box, either playing strong safety, more of that Jordan Whitehead box role, not Jordan Whitehead deep, but in the box, or you have him playing that big nickel. He showed that he definitely, that sideline to sideline speed, the reason that the Jets drafted him, he's going to cost, a little over $1 million. I would definitely sign him. And kicker punter, just bring back the crew from last year. They did a great job. There's no reason to do anything else. So I think this pod is getting long enough, but that's it for my discussion of the Jets free agency. I will try to come to you as often as I can, even during the off season. Sometimes there's really not anything to talk about, but we'll get into it. Maybe I'll get some video pods in, get some guests, maybe take some questions. We'll see. Just getting this started. But please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Once again, I'm Rivka Boord, host of the Scoreboard podcast. And please check out our website at Jets X Factor for the best New York Jets content on the internet.